Hello there, listeners of the Bylines Network podcast, and welcome to this very special episode brought to you by Ginny Smith of Sussex Bylines.
In this wide-ranging interview, Ginny talks to Mr. Campbell about many topics, including the rise of AI, recent developments in America, his time working in government, and the importance of citizen journalism. We hope you enjoy this fascinating interview.
Alastair, thank you so much for being with us today on a cold Monday morning and in Germany. And there are a number of topics I'd like to explore with you. In particular, the increasing popularity of alternative media, podcasts, webinars, and our own online journalism, citizen journalism, Bylines Network, as well, of course, as world events, which are moving at such a tremendous pace. I mean, obviously, your name is incredibly well known, and some aspects of your career very well known, and people have, as I've discovered with friends talking to me, very definite opinions of you, both very strongly positive and less so. But I think it'd be great if listeners could actually know a little bit more about you, your background.
Okay, you sound like one of the introductions to one of our Rest is Politics leading interviews. We always start with childhood. I was born in 1957 in Keighley, New Yorkshire. My dad was a vet. My mum was a farmer's daughter who really just, saw herself as a wife, housewife, family person. I have two older brothers, both now dead, and a younger sister, thankfully still alive. I grew up really not knowing what I wanted to do in my life at all. I never really had ambitions beyond the obvious crazy ambitions that most boys have. I wanted to be a footballer. My dad was a vet, as I say. He had a very bad accident when I was a kid, and we couldn't visit in hospital. So I used to write to him every day, and it was literally like a diary. And I think that's where the whole thing started, of me sort of committing thoughts to paper. So I've always written a lot. When I became a journalist, it didn't surprise me, but at the same time, there was nothing in my past, my background, to suggest that I might be a journalist. And you probably finding this now in what you're doing is that, and you mentioned, you said to all your friends, you're going to be interviewing me, and some said this and some said that. The thing about once you say you're a journalist, you can ask anybody anything. And I think that's the great privilege of journalism, which I think a lot of journalists don't really appreciate. I was always amazed when I was a journalist how you could go out to people in the street and just start conversations with them. And generally they would talk to you. So I think curiosity about the world is probably what made me become a journalist. And
do you feel you've kept that curiosity? Has it got blunted in any way over the years?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't think it has got blunted. No, I think I'm still very, very curious about the world. The podcast I do with Rory Stewart, I think the reason why it's taken off in the way that it has is because actually for both of us, it's a very different form of what we've done before. So it's partly journalistic, it's partly political, but I'm always on the lookout for stuff that maybe challenges what I think. I've got one of my many golden rules in life is never go to bed without knowing something you didn't know when you woke up.
Yeah.
Always wanting to know new things, read new things, hear new things, and work out how they fit with what you think you already know.
It's interesting that you mentioned the podcast, because I'd love to come on to that. And it has been, incredibly popular, top of the leaderboard for 2 years now.
Pretty much, yeah.
And why do you think it's so popular?
I honestly think it's hard to work out. I think it's because if you think about the way that people kind of reflect about the media, if you say to most people, the media has gone to pot, populism, polarization, you can't believe anybody, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Nobody can concentrate longer than a tweet. Mm. That's the sort of conventional wisdom. And yet our podcast is based on the idea of without graphics, without film, two people, usually in hotel rooms like this one, different parts of the world, talking to each other about stuff that other people are talking about all the time. I think it speaks to actually a deeper desire that people actually are still interested in politics, interested in world affairs, but very frustrated about the way that politics and world affairs are coming across to them, either through the media, conventional media, or through the politicians themselves. I've been amazed how many people have said to me in recent weeks, for example, I'm just not watching the news. I cannot watch the news. I can't bear the sight of Trump. I can't bear the sight of Musk, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And yet they're still listening to us. I think that hopefully is because we're trying to give it without hiding our own politics and our own views, we're trying to give it that broader context. But I'll be honest, Ginny, I think it's very weird. When we did the tour just before Christmas and we did the O2, we're sitting there with 13, 14, 15,000 people in this arena. Rory Stewart is literally doing a presentation to a slide about the tax intake and where taxes come from. And at one point, and then the slide disappeared. And this guy in the front is shouting, more, more. And I almost got the giggles. I kept looking around and I thought, what are you all doing here? This is just two blokes talking. So it's a bit surreal. It is honestly a bit surreal.
It comes across as though, there's a lot of affectionate teasing that goes on now. And I wondered how much you think you've influenced one another over the 2 years that you spend obviously quite a big chunk of the week really in those recording those podcasts. How much do you think you have influenced one another over those 2 years?
It's very hard to know. I mean, but again, I find that part of the weirdness that people say it's been very interesting to watch your relationship evolve like we're kind of some kind of couple. I find that very weird. I don't know how much we've influenced each other. Part of the point of a podcast, I think this is the same with anybody who's in any form of journalism, there's a part of your mind that's always thinking about it. So I'll give you an example, very, very topical, very current. The interview we've got out today is with Yulia Navalny, who we interviewed a couple of weeks ago, the wife of Alexei Navalny, murdered in prison by the Putin regime, etc. So I'm in Germany. I turn on the TV this morning. I'm channel hopping because I want to see stuff about the TV debate that was here last night between the election party candidates. There's a German television documentary about Navalny. And so part of me is watching it because I think it's interesting, but actually I'm also watching it because I think, we can talk about this and I can bring something to this that he doesn't have. What I think Rory would say, is that I've made him more aware of the importance of political strategy and of the communication of strategy. And I think he has made me think more about the way that foreign policy works on the ground, as it were. And that goes back to the very first time I met Rory, really, was when he interviewed me for a podcast he was doing when he was running to be Mayor of London. And it never went out because they decided, actually, for whatever reason, they just thought at that time that was not going to work in the way he wanted to. But we had a very, very long discussion about Iraq.
Yeah.
From the perspective of me sitting alongside a prime minister in charge of a very, very big decision, and him on the ground, subsequently, actually having to deal with the consequences of that decision. And so I think that is where I'd say the influence comes. But look, we were in Syria last week together. And just the two of us, because the podcast, we hired local people to do the stuff we were doing with the president. But I was sort of thinking, when we started, what would I have thought about going on the road for a few days with Rory Stewart stuck in the back of a car for quite a long time, on the plane together, sharing a hotel. There was a horrible moment when we arrived at the hotel when they told us that we had to share a room, and we both went, no, get another room. We've definitely got a much, much deeper understanding of each other, what we think, how we operate.
Do you feel that you've sort of learnt anything? You may not have got any sort of broad messages out, but do you feel that you have learnt anything as a result of interviewing all these incredibly different people over the years? What have you learnt about leadership?
I learned anything. Look, I've obviously learned things about the people that we're interviewing, hopefully. I think more generally, what's really strange is that, I don't know if you find this when you're doing interviews, but when I'm doing the interviews, I'm so sort of focused on things that I think I should raise, things that I've said to myself in advance, we should definitely talk about that. And then the interview often goes off in a different direction. I don't really remember what we've talked about. And it's only when I listen back that I kind of think, oh, that's interesting, that's important. So, for example, the one we did recently with Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
I thought I knew Angela Merkel well, both from a public perspective and a political perspective. But I had a sense of her at the end of it as being maybe a lot less confident than most people would imagine for somebody who's been Chancellor of Germany for 16 years. Just in her demeanour and in the way she spoke about certain things, the things that she wanted to talk about, the things that she didn't maybe feel so comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
I'll give you a very good example. Kwasi Kwarteng, whether he likes it or not, he's going to be defined forever as the guy who did that crazy mini budget for Liz Truss. And I bumped into him on the tube. I saw him sitting there. He was ignoring everybody. He was sort of head buried in a newspaper. And he was sitting right by the corner. So I went and stood by him. He didn't see me. And then after a while, I just leant over and said, "Oi, when you going to apologise for that fucking budget then?" Before recognising it was me, he said, I have apologised. Then he saw me and burst out laughing. And I said, "Listen, when are you going to come on the podcast?" He said, "Yeah, I'll come on the podcast." And then Rory Stewart was a bit iffy about it. I don't know. I don't think I'll be able to hold myself in and be respectful and disagree agreeably. I think I'll get really... Anyway, we persuaded him. We did it. And what was interesting in that one, we set it as most of the interviews are about 50 minutes. We were about half an hour in. And I said, "Kwasi, what are you doing after this?" He said, "Oh, not much. I've got a lunch on, but nothing much." And I said, "I think it'd be good if we could just keep this going," because it was genuinely very, very interesting to have a sense of how those decisions came to be made, what he thought at the time set against what he was saying at the time, because that was his job. He was the Chancellor for a newly elected Prime Minister. And I think at the end of it, I just had a better understanding of him and of what happened. Now, whether that helps anybody in the real world, I've got no idea, but they're the ones I enjoy, is when something happens you don't expect. Theresa May was another one. Theresa May, lots of people said they'd never heard her be so open. Now, by comparison with, a Trump or a Johnson, that she's still very kind of constrained. But at the same time, when you listen back to it, she is much, much more open than the public image. They're the ones that I really, really enjoy.
That has something to do with the quality of your and Rory's questioning, maybe, that people aren't immediately put on the defensive, that they open up much more, that they feel that they're genuinely being listened to, and the questions are not attacks. They're genuine questions founded on a genuine interest.
Rory and I don't really discuss what we're going to ask before. I don't know if you see the ones when we're on like this online, but we're regularly pointing at each other. And all that means is you take the next question. It doesn't mean I know what the next question is. Most people are actually, they do like talking about their upbringing and their values and their influences and that kind of thing. So, and the other thing, we genuinely don't care whether it gets picked up in the media. We're not looking for a story. We don't. If there is a great story, then fine.
Yeah.
But we're not looking for it. We're not thinking, right, they've never said this about this, let's try and get them to do that. We just don't operate like that at all.
Just going back now to the beginnings of your career in local journalism and thinking about the situation today, which has seen a pretty catastrophic decline in local journalism, how fragmented the media scene has become. So there are entrepreneurial efforts like our own, like Bylines Network. A lot of people are getting most of their news from podcasts now, or from TikTok or wherever. What are your thoughts about that and about the implications for our politics generally?
If I go back to when I started at the Tavistock Times in the early 80s, if you'd have said, people would sit around and talk about the media, they basically meant the newspapers, the television and the radio. That was it. And specialist magazines, Golf Monthly, Shoot, women's magazines, all that stuff, right? All of that is still there to some extent, but it's in this very, very atomized media ecosystem where, frankly, most people now just construct their own media landscape. What has the impact been on politics? It's clearly been, huge. But the politicians, I think, sometimes underestimate. Unfortunately, Trump doesn't. Trump really has worked this out. They underestimate sometimes how much they can still be in control of the agenda, provided they have an agenda that is clear and strong and you can drive it through. We interviewed Mark Carney at the weekend, the former Bank of England governor who's now running to be Prime Minister in Canada. I was just looking in advance of it, and I saw a poll saying that only 24% of Canadians recognised him. That's a guy who in a few weeks' time could be Prime Minister. Now, why is that? It's because for most of his life, he's been doing things that haven't necessarily been directly connected to the life of most Canadians. Bank of England governor, even when he was Bank of Canada governor, he wouldn't have been that high profile compared to, you know, a Trudeau, or let alone one of those wonderful Canadian ice hockey players who was tearing lumps out of the Americans at the weekend. Mm-hmm. I think it just means you've got to work harder to get your message heard and understand that ultimately the means by which you can communicate your message have proliferated out of all recognition. But that to me says be much more strategic about what the message is. So what you guys are doing, and you know, the reason I agree to do the interviews, I think it's important what you're doing. You know, citizen journalism can mean lots of different things. There are lots of bad citizens out there. There's quite a lot of bad citizen journalism. Mm. You know, I would argue that the ecosystem that the Trump MAGA people have created is a big part of his success, but it's also a big part of the problems that we have in the world about, you know, the normalization of lying, not worrying about facts, thinking that insult is basically what politics is all about. Yeah. You know, as you say, I'm in Germany, and Vance was here a few days ago, made this extraordinary speech to the Munich Security Conference, which was just, you know, we won an election in America, therefore I can come and tell you you're all a heap of shit. I asked a friend in America how that speech was playing out in America. I mean, it's been sort of roundly condemned in most of Europe. And the answer came back, Fox News love it, MSNBC hate it. That's it. and of course, essentially what he was doing, this goes back to my point about what was his purpose. His purpose was actually to play to that domestic audience.
Yeah.
It worked. It cut through.
Interestingly, the BBC still, well, certainly Radio 4, which I listen to probably far too much, it's all taken from the large print newspapers whose readership is declining massively. So they very rarely take into account that plethora of sources that are now potentially available to them.
When I was a journalist, before I sort of jumped over to politics, but in the late 80s, early 90s, I regularly used to present on BBC Breakfast Television a review of the papers. Mm. I had a lot of editorial freedom. I remember once getting told off because I was mentioning Burnley and Blackburn and our rivalry too much. Clearly, my political perspective was known, and that was all kind of fine. I think what's happened since then is that partly because what the right in politics always do better than the left. They're much better at making their enemies think that their enemies are the problem, not them. The BBC has slightly bought the line that it's kind of, you know, it's run by a bunch of lefties. It's very hard to make that claim when you actually look at the personnel in some very, very key positions.
Yeah.
And yet they kind of buy that line. So the right wing, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Sun, the Express, the Times, for their own vested interest, whether that's the Murdoch papers or the Mail papers, they pump out this stuff about the BBC being left wing, and the BBC feel they have to overcompensate. This is what's deciding their agenda for the day. If the Mail and the Times and the Telegraph are all leading on the same story, usually put there by, dare I say, a spin doctor working for the Tories or working for a think tank, whatever it might be, they sort of feel they have to cover that story. This used to drive me crazy when we were in government. As you know, I'm editor-at-large at the New European. You could count on the fingers of one finger how many times the New European gets mentioned in a review of the papers, because it's seen as, I don't know, left-wing, new media, whatever it might be. But they'd be far more interesting if they did actually reflect this new ecosystem that's developing both left and right.
And just keeping with the whole theme of journalism at the moment, I guess that certainly discussions that I'm sure you will have had and we will have had behind the scenes is the potential threat of artificial intelligence to original journalism.
Yeah.
And taking it a little bit further, perhaps, the potential massive threat that would be caused to globally, really, to the whole reporting and news scene if Musk is successful eventually in getting his hands on OpenAI, which he's made a bid for, Sam Altman's OpenAI.
I mean, there's a book I talk about a lot, written by Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad in 1997 called The Sovereign Individual. And I sort of feel that these people who are now so to the fore in the world of business, in the world of politics now, with Musk in particular, but also people like Peter Thiel, there's this whole sense that the sovereign individual is kind of really becoming real now. And what does that mean? That means somebody who essentially doesn't just feel that they're above politics, but actually to a large extent is. And a symbol of that recently, I think largely bad things about Trump, but even with him there, you do retain a sort of a respect for the office, a respect for the Oval Office. And you have this scene where Elon Musk wearing a Make America Great baseball cap, a T-shirt, his son on his shoulders, Trump sort of sitting there like a minion almost, as Musk is giving forth. The guy's standing there saying, I am right now in this moment physically above this guy. I am intellectually above this guy because I'm talking about things and he's looking a bit confused. I'm with you people in the media. I'm above you because whatever questions you throw at me, I'm just going to basically say what I want. And meanwhile, he's, raiding all these government departments, abusing anybody who gets in his way, up to and including judges. I think it's a massive, massive, massive problem. Now, that's a separate issue, or it's related, but your question was specifically about AI. I mean, I think any modern technology that comes along, there will be risks and there will also be opportunities. I regularly ask ChatGPT, what do you think Alastair Campbell and Rory Stewart will talk about on The Rest is Politics? And they do pretty well. They do pretty well. They regularly miss the sort of smaller stuff that we might talk about. So like protests in Serbia or, something going off in the Côte d'Ivoire, whatever it might be. But big stuff, they tend to get, that's me sort of playing with it, as it were. You said earlier the impact that the technological change has had on local media, local newspapers, really, really struggling. So there is a part of you that thinks, well, actually, maybe AI can help them survive, help them develop, provided they kind of look at it in a non-threatening way, use it in a non-threatening way. But I think that what we're talking about is a scale of technological revolution that I'm not sure any of us truly know how it's going to pan out. What I think we have to hope for is that no matter the power of the technology, interactions like this, human being to human being, are always going to have their place in the media ecosystem. And ultimately, that is what will drive excellence, as opposed to kind of a mediocrity that everybody can have access to in the same way. So I think the important thing is not to get too spooked. It's going to change everything, that's for sure, but don't get so spooked by that we say to ourselves, in the end, robot to robot is going to be a better discussion than human to human, because I think if that happens, we've all had it anyway.
And just picking up the Elon Musk scenario with the son at one point, I think, sitting on the desk, wasn't he? An extraordinary picture. Thinking about Starmer's visit, which is planned, I believe, in the next week or so to the US to meet with Trump. What would you be saying to him? How would you be advising him to deal with Trump over that visit?
Well, it's tricky, that's for sure. Every leader in the world is thinking about this. So when we first came on the scene, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, it was a good fit. But if you go back and read my diaries, we really thought through and worked out how best to handle the first meeting, handle the first trip to the White House, handle his first trip to London. And I think both of us, both countries, got a lot out of that relationship, not least say in relation to Northern Ireland, where Clinton was a great supporter, or Kosovo, where, if I look at what's going on in the discussions now about NATO and Ukraine and how difficult and complicated that is, given that America seems to be saying it's your problem. That's tricky. So I would say it's important for Keir Starmer to be respectful of the man and of the office, but not under any circumstances just to become an echo or a cipher. And actually, it's been interesting to me. I mentioned Mark Carney. Canada, both governing politicians and opposition politicians, they've been very, very strong in their messaging about Trump and all this stuff about tariffs. I was pleased that when Trump came out with his sort of Gaza-Largo plan, let's turn Gaza into a kind of, a Jared Kushner-style holiday camp for very, very rich people from around the world, whatever it is he has in his head, that Keir Starmer came straight out and said, what he's always said about two-state solution and it's not a real estate deal, etc. And likewise in relation to Ukraine, when they came out the other day and Trump basically saying, look, I'll sort this out with Vlad at a little bilateral in Saudi Arabia, that Keir came out and said that, there can be no discussion of Ukraine without Europe, without Ukraine, and there can no discussion about Europe without Europe. So it's important he holds to that. And I think you have to find the things that really allow you to develop some kind of relationship that gives you an in that others maybe don't have. And I'll tell you why this is important. When Trump came out and said the things he said about Gaza and about Ukraine, and the truth is, he had Netanyahu in mind and he had Putin in mind. Now, you have to be in the American president's head. You have to be in there so that when he's thinking of doing something or saying something, at least part of him has a little twitch going, oh, what will Keir Starmer think about that? What will von der Leyen think about that? What will Macron think about that? Now, you're only going to be in their head if you put yourself there. So I don't know whether that answers your questions, but I'd be basically saying the aim is to make sure when he's making big decisions, he at least understands this has an impact well beyond the United States of America.
Key point, absolutely. As you say, I guess that it's something that all politicians are struggling with at the moment. How do we get inside that head? How do we just get that warning signal inside his head so that he just steps back a bit? Reverting to UK politics, but just thinking about an individual who appears to be on the up and up at the moment and who you had a very interesting exchange with on a recent Question Time, Nigel Farage, the increasing popularity apparently of the Reform Party. How would you be advising a Labour government on how to respond to the threat that Reform and Nigel Farage appear to be posing at the moment in UK politics?
Well, I think it's really important to separate out the perception that they're trying to create about themselves and what's actually happening. So if you look at the polls, you can say Reform are doing quite well. Then go and look at all the local by-elections that have been taking place. And you start to wonder whether this isn't all a bit of a media myth. Now, I'm not saying it's not dangerous. It's very dangerous, both to the Conservatives and to Labour. But if I can plug the New European again, I think they put on their website a speech I made last week. But I mentioned specifically about Farage. Labour have got to stop treating him the way the media treat him, which is like a sort of an exotic celebrity. He's been a politician for a long time, but one of his successes as a politician is that he's managed to present himself as being almost outside politics. I would argue that Nigel Farage's only real contribution to British life and British history has been his role in delivering Brexit. Brexit has been a disaster for this country.
Yeah.
Now, you can argue about the scale of it, but even Nigel Farage, and you saw it in that programme, He doesn't stand there saying, I'll tell you what Brexit's done, it's done this. All he says, it's over, the war's over, you lost, we won, move on. Now I'm fighting about net zero, now I'm fighting about immigration. He shouldn't be allowed to talk about immigration without him being challenged over his role in getting Brexit, which saw over 1 million Europeans leave and net migration 2.3 million of people coming from India, Nigeria, Bangladesh. Is that what he meant when he said we were taking back control? Is that what Johnson meant? So challenge him.
Yeah.
And don't let him away with the nonsense that he talks. Now, he's very good at it. You mentioned TikTok. Nigel Farage, I think, has got more TikTok followers than any other British politician. So he can go on there for 20 seconds and he can do his little films, but you've got to expose that that's what he's doing. You can't just ignore him because he is now in Parliament. I always felt this about him. When he did get into Parliament, that would give him a bigger role, a bigger platform. Labour are now the incumbent government in an era when people don't like incumbent governments. But don't be so defensive. And don't be so defensive about Brexit. Don't be so defensive about Farage. When you look at these polls, the one that people keep saying where he was ahead of Labour, it was one of these kind of, I don't know, I hesitate to say bogus, but it's one of these polls where you've got to be very, very, very careful about the findings. But my main point is, the most important thing Labour have to do is to govern the country well and make the changes that they said they were going to make and use a big majority to do that. In relation to the Conservatives, never let the Conservatives away with the nonsense they come up with, because most of the stuff Labour are having to do, the really difficult stuff, is because of the state that the country was left in. And with reform, treat them like politicians, challenge them, expose them, call them out, and make sure they don't get away with this bullshit narrative that they've been able to get away with for so long. For my mind, Johnson and Farage should not be able to walk down the streets without people challenging them over Brexit.
Yeah.
When was the last time you actually saw Farage being properly challenged over his role in Brexit? The media's given up.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And
yeah,
why that's happened, why the media has given up, and why he appears to be really pretty much let off the leash.
Well, I'll tell you why, because they've got a lot to answer for in relation to Brexit too. So they don't want to talk about it either. They just want to pretend that there's some mythical other Brexit that could have happened when everything would have been fine. If you look at the sums involved and the money, the hit to our economy, the money that we would have had we not left, we wouldn't have to be looking down the sofa to find money for defence. We'd have it.
Yeah.
But for their own reasons, Labour seem afraid to talk about Brexit. This make Brexit work thing, it won't work.
Yeah.
The only way you can approach Brexit is to say we're going to fix the mess. You have to accept that it's created a mess. Peter Kellner, the pollster, he sent me an email this morning with a piece he's written on his Substack. He's been out talking to business people, small and medium-sized businesses, just about the form filling they now have to do. I bet Farage doesn't even think about this. Johnson certainly wouldn't think about it. One of these business guys saying that his costs have gone up because he's now no longer using, when he's got the form filling, which is a nightmare, but he says his costs are going up in part because he's now having to use European Union freight once his goods get into Europe. Why? Because the guys that he used to use in Britain have stopped bothering to try to take stuff into the European Union because of all the botheration and the buggeration. And these are the people who said, away with Brussels red tape. They've imposed so much red tape on businesses that they're absolutely, some of them being totally destroyed and giving up on exporting at all. And we still fantasize about an American trade deal. I mean, do we seriously think this is a guy who's he had the best trade deal in history with Canada and Mexico. He gets elected and decides to say it's the worst trade deal that anybody ever did, as though it was somebody else who did it.
It's a massive issue.
Yeah.
Given the turbulent times that we live in, and it can feel extremely scary out there really at the moment. Who and what do you feel have been and are your personal rocks? Who and what do you sort of hang on to sometimes if you, like I guess most of us are feeling what the hell is coming down the road at us next.
Family, Fiona, my partner in the main, and family generally, and friendship. I think they are unbelievably important. But I do get a lot of hope when I go into schools.
Mm-hmm.
The last 2 books I wrote were kids' books, and I've been to quite a few schools. And I think young people get a really bad rep. I think they're far more aware of what's going on, far more interested than we give them credit for. Yes, they're on TikTok. Yes, they're posing for Instagram the whole time, etc., etc., etc. But actually, I find some of the best discussions I have about the state of the world and about the state of politics are with younger people, including, I was in a primary school recently. I had some great thoughts and insights, and so that gives me hope. And I think the other thing you have to do, you have to look at where change comes in a way that maybe you think is better than the change that we're feeling and hearing the whole time. Now, sometimes I must admit, sometimes I can't. I lie there in bed, literally worried about the state of the planet and what happens if America really does pull the plug and all this sort of stuff. And it is scary for a lot of people. But I think there's plenty you can look at, take inspiration. I mentioned Navalny. I mean, listen to the interview with his wife. It really is like inspiring. That courage still exists. Look at Zelensky. Look at that guy. I mean, just think about how much pressure he's been under, how much hate he's had to endure, how much violence upon his people, but he's still going. I look at, Donald Tusk in Poland. I think he gives me hope. I know Macron gets a very bad press at home, but I still think Macron's an exceptional political leader. So you've got to find the little pockets of hope. I think the other thing is to see things in a historical context. Yes, we can go through very bad periods in history. Maybe this is one. No matter how bad it gets, and it does get bad, usually something good comes out of it at the end. And so I think that's the sort of mindset you have to hold on to. And I think the other thing I'd say, Ginny, is that, the stuff that you're doing, essentially it's people saying, I don't like the media that we get pumped at us the whole time. I'm not sold on a lot of the politics that gets pumped at us the whole time, but I think there is stuff out there worth talking about. There are people out there worth talking to about it. And so, all power to your elbow and to that of your colleagues, because I think you're doing a great job.
And I just love that, and a great note to end on. And a massive thanks to you, Alastair, for your time and a really, really interesting session.
Thank you, Ginny. Did you hear my dog snoring at all in the background?
No.
Oh, good, because I'm glad about that. Fantastic. All right, guys.
Thanks, Alastair. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating interview, Ginny. And thank you very much to Alastair Campbell for agreeing to be interviewed by us. The Bylines Network is powered by you. We have no backing from billionaires or oligarchs, just the kind, generous donations of you, our readers and our listeners. If you haven't already, please consider supporting us. Just go to the website and click donate, or go to our Chuffed page and donate to our crowdfunding campaign to help keep the lights on. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the end of the month for our next episode.